how did we get to a point where the cultural left became ultimately the dominant strain of thought, and that at least so many um, people who were on paper they're high achievers, that's the reason why they're getting into university, etc. How is it that they've ended up particularly taken with this ideology?
Yeah, I mean that's really yeah. They're two kind of separate questions, I suppose. I
Mm,
mean, one is the intellectual lineage, and you can see strands of three long-held ideas. One is egalitarianism, this idea of pursuing equality, however we want to define that. Now, of course, there's equal treatment and equal outcome, but in this haze called egalitarianism, people who are in favor of that often don't make that distinction, even though it's a very important distinction. So you've got egalitarianism, which goes back, well, back to the French Revolution, back even further, ultimately, perhaps to strands of Christianity. You have humanitarianism, again, with that sort of Christian and Enlightenment lineage. And so humanitarianism, being nice and kind to the weak. If you actually push that logic further and further and further, oh, well, we don't want to speak a truth that might be unkind to the emotional sensibilities of a group that we're designating as a weak group. You see where this is going. So there are sort of some long strands to this ideology, but I think the key juncture is really the mid 1960s when you have this new anti-racism taboo suddenly emerging in the U.S. and the cultural power of that, as Shelby Steele in his book White Guilt talks about that you had this dramatic shift in cultural power from where blacks had to defer to whites to where whites had to defer to blacks because they'd admitted some sin and they wanted to be the good whites, so they had to virtue signal by adopting the right policies and buzzwords. And that is what drives the system, is this idea that to sort of burnish your bona fide as one of the good, not one of the fallen whites, and therefore retain your cultural power and moral authority as an institution or as an individual. And I think that really is the key to this. And what the left does is it really wants to lean into and borrow that cultural power, that kryptonite that surrounds race. And other groups, feminists and gay and lesbian and trans, also want to borrow some of that cultural power as well of that. And that is sort of the identity politics paradigm, which comes into place in the late 60s, at least intellectually now. However, okay, so, Chris Rufo and Fukuyama and Yasha Monk and all these people are talking about these intellectual innovations like critical legal studies, the ancestor of critical race theory, Black Panther ideology, which is saying, the American Constitution is a smokescreen for slavery and racism. All these sorts of ideas are there in the late 60s ferment. Radical feminism is also talking about patriarchy. So you can focus on those ideas, but I actually, and those are very important, but I place a lot of more emphasis in my book anyway on the liberals. And when I say the liberals, I don't mean classical liberals, but I do mean modern liberals and the big swath of liberalism as we enter the 20th, particularly later in the 20th, but even to some degree earlier in the 20th century. There's a lot of egalitarianism that gets imported into mainstream liberalism. So what we call modern liberalism is not the same as 19th century John Stuart Mill or Jeremy Bentham, John Locke style liberalism. It's much less about freedom and it's much more about equality, and it's oriented against majorities in society. So this new liberalism is really, I think, the main reason that woke is so successful. Because it's not just enough to say, oh, well, you had Eldridge Cleaver and Angela Davis and the Weather Underground being, these people being hired into prestigious universities. The question is, why were they hired by universities dominated by liberals, who leaned left, but they were not Marxist and they didn't believe in Marxism? What is it that was so appealing about these radicals? You can ask another question. Why did 51% of Seattle voters vote to defund the police initially? I mean, these are not Marxists. Why did Lyndon Johnson support affirmative action, which came to mean quotas? Again, this is somebody who's a tough anti-communist. And so it is that liberal group, that sort of group that I would say have a number of features. So they're not about a revolution. They're not about overthrowing society. And we failed on class, so now we're going to move to race. That's not what these people are about. What they are about instead is guilt, right? That post-65 white guilt, and the anti-racism taboo. They want to stay, they don't want to. They want to be on the right side of that. And compassion towards this newly sacred group. So that guilt and compassion, bleeding heart liberal complex, I think is really important. And what that means is that any new innovation, like quotas, like speech codes, and later on talk about systemic race, some of the critical race theory stuff, white privilege, systemic racism, all of that stuff finds a very strong resonance amongst these left liberals who are, they have their own innovations. Political correctness comes out of left liberalism. Affirmative action comes out of left liberalism. And the new innovations from the cultural Marxists around critical race theory, radical gender ideology, actually mesh pretty well with a pre-existing sensibility. Not entirely. Some of the left liberals don't like people being fired for speech, for example. So they have a few boundaries to some degree. But it's a nice marriage. And I just think that sort of left liberal part of the equation has really been neglected, even though that left liberal group, like in a university, that's 50 to 60%, whereas the hardcore cultural left might be 20%. And I think it's more important to explain the 50 to 60 than the 20. If you want to explain why, as you say, the conquest law, why do these institutions drift? I think it's because of that core left liberal group. And that left liberal group is actually much more influential in the mass culture, in the youth culture as well. What they say kind of goes in the mainstream media, for example. So I think they have pushed the culture in the direction of radical egalitarianism and radical hypersensitivity around offense, incrementally, step by step by step by step, in a ratcheting way, not this sudden march through the institutions revolution. I don't buy that argument from Rufo and Lindsay. I mean, there's something to it, but I don't think it's the main story.
You've effectively defined cultural socialism through a whole bunch of different case studies there. What's the counterweight? You've spoken about there being these two different strands which organizations can choose to promote: cultural socialism, and we've gone through a bunch of examples now, and cultural liberalism. One, what is that? And two, why should people want it?
Well, so cultural socialism is just, in a way, the moral intuitions that arise out of woke. So woke is about sacralizing these groups. Cultural socialism is, equal outcomes. So no race, no gender gaps. So equal outcomes and emotional harm protection through speech codes. So the equal outcomes is equity and diversity. The speech codes is inclusion. So EDI is really the policy that emerges out of this philosophy. And that is opposed to, what I would call human flourishing. Now, I've talked about two strands to this human flourishing ideology, which I'd say or cultural wealth ideology, which is different from cultural socialism. Very similar to the way we think about economic socialism as something that makes an economy stagnate. So you have a command and control, or even a very high tax economy will have very low rates of economic growth, but will be more equal. You have economic socialism versus economic freedom or economic wealth. Similarly, I think if you go cultural socialism, then you also strangle the cultural wealth production of a society. And you can just see that very clearly if an author wants to write from the perspective of a young black man and they're white, if they want to play a black person in a stage production, that you can clearly see where that's out of bounds. So that's going to restrict the creativity of a society. All kinds of forms of expression are frowned upon, and people have to sort of mind their P's and Q's more. You're not going to have as much cultural creativity in society. So there's this kind of social, equity and wealth trade-off in the culture as there is in the economy. And there's two strands to that human flourishing or cultural wealth perspective. I mean, one is this cultural liberalism, which is freedom of speech, scientific truth, objective truth, due process, equal treatment. That's the Enlightenment classical liberalism that's in trouble because it goes against a number of things. It goes against this idea of equal outcomes, and it goes against the idea of not offending any one of the totemic groups if you speak a truth that they don't want to hear, or that the most sensitive member amongst them doesn't want to hear. And then on the other side, we have cultural conservatism, which is the other part of the equation of who's against cultural socialism. And these are people who are attached to their nation. If they're a member of the ethnic majority, if they are a man or a woman, and they are into that traditional gender binary, if they want to keep Spanish, having different genders, all of these sorts of attachments to existing traditions and identities. That's sort of your conservatism. So if someone wants to rewrite books and knock down statues, that's going to offend, or that's going to run up against those for whom these are very important attachments and traditions. So you've kind of got these two things, this cultural liberalism and cultural conservatism, which I put under this umbrella of this human flourishing cultural wealth perspective, colliding with cultural socialism. And that's where we're seeing increasing political divisions starting to build on top of this.